My son invited me to his wedding until I recognized the bride's dark secret. I struggled with whether to warn him or stay silent. The truth eventually surfaced, reshaping our family bond. When I saw the woman standing beside my son in that engagement photo, my chest tightened like a door slamming shut inside me. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't nerves about him growing up and building a life that didn't orbit mine anymore. It was recognition. Sharp, sudden, and deeply unwelcome. I remember the way my coffee went cold in my hands as I stared at the screen. The tiny details jumped out first. The familiar curve of her smile. The slight tilt of her head, as if she were always listening for something just out of frame. The pale scar near her left eyebrow that makeup never quite hid. My fingers trembled against the ceramic mug. For a moment, I told myself I was imagining things. Faces blur with time. Memory reshapes itself. But my body knew before my mind accepted it. That woman had once destroyed a good man's life, and now she was about to marry my son. Before that morning, my life had been quiet in the best possible way. Predictable, soft around the edges. I worked part-time at the local library after retiring from administrative work at a manufacturing company, the same company where my son's childhood had been marked by after-school pickups and late dinners waiting for me to come home. My small apartment smelled perpetually of lemon cleaner and old paperbacks. The radiator clicked in the winter. The upstairs neighbor practiced violin badly but earnestly every evening around 6. My son, Daniel, called me every Sunday, without fail. Sometimes it was just 5 minutes while he folded laundry or drove back from the grocery store. Sometimes longer when something weighed on him. I cherished those calls like small gifts. His voice steady, warm, still carrying hints of the boy who used to ask me to check for monsters under his bed. When he told me he'd met someone serious, I felt the kind of happiness that settles slowly rather than explodes. Relief, gratitude, pride. He'd had his share of heartbreaks, relationships that fizzled out quietly, mismatched ambitions, long-distance fatigue. I wanted him to find someone kind, someone steady, someone who treated him gently. Her name's Claire, he said over the phone one evening, the hum of traffic faint in the background. I think you'd really like her, Mom. I smiled into the receiver, picturing a woman I hadn't yet met. If she makes you laugh the way you're laughing right now, then I already do. A few months later, the engagement photo arrived in a family group message. Daniel standing tall in a simple navy suit, Claire in a light dress, sunlight threading through her hair, both of them glowing with that particular hope that only exists when the future still feels like a promise instead of a responsibility. That was the moment my chest tightened. I enlarged the photo. My heart began to thud in my ears, drowning out the ticking wall clock. The room felt suddenly smaller, air heavier. A memory I hadn't touched in years stirred like a bruise being pressed too hard. I whispered her name without realizing it. Not Claire. Her real name, or at least the one I had known her by years ago, slipped from my lips like a confession. Back then, I worked closely with a man named Marcus. He was quiet, thoughtful, always carrying a thermos of terrible instant coffee and a photograph of his daughter taped inside his locker. We shared early shifts, traded weekend stories, complained about management in hushed tones by the vending machines. He trusted easily, maybe too easily. When the scandal hit, it came fast and ruthless. An anonymous complaint, an internal investigation, whispers spreading like smoke through the break room, accusations that didn't quite make sense but were serious enough to end a career. Marcus denied everything, his face pale and stunned, like someone who'd been pushed into cold water without warning. I remembered the way his hands shook when he tried to explain himself to me in the parking lot, the way his voice cracked when he said, "I don't even understand what they're saying I did." He was gone within weeks. Only later did the truth surface, quietly, imperfectly, too late to repair the damage. Evidence that pointed back to a woman who had manipulated documents, twisted conversations, protected her own advancement by sacrificing someone else's reputation. She disappeared from the company before accountability could catch her. And now, years later, her face stared back at me from my phone, smiling beside my son. I set the phone down slowly, as if it might burn me. My apartment felt unbearably silent. Even the radiator had stopped clicking. I could hear my my own breathing, uneven and shallow. My happiness for Daniel tangled instantly with dread, guilt, and a growing knot of fear I didn't yet know how to untangle. What if I was wrong? What if this was coincidence? And what if I wasn't? I picked the phone up again, stared at her face, and felt the past pressing closer than I'd allowed it to in years. This was only the beginning of a question I wasn't ready to answer. For the rest of that day, I moved through my apartment like a guest in someone else's life. I washed the same mug twice without realizing it. I stood in front of the refrigerator long enough for the motor to hum impatiently at me. My mind kept pulling the image back into focus, the curve of her smile, the scar, the familiar posture, like a stubborn puzzle piece that refused to fit anywhere else. I kept telling myself it was ridiculous. People share faces. Time reshapes memory. Trauma exaggerates recognition. I hadn't seen that woman in nearly a decade. Maybe I was projecting old guilt onto a stranger who happened to resemble her, but there was a strange certainty in my chest that logic couldn't soothe. That night, I pulled out a dusty shoebox from the back of my closet. Inside were old notebooks, folded schedules, a handful of printed emails I'd saved from my years at the plant, remnants of a life I thought I'd already finished grieving. I hadn't opened that box in years. The cardboard smelled faintly of dust and dryer sheets. Buried beneath yellowed sticky notes was a printed incident memo, a copy I'd kept because something about the case had never sat right with me. The name at the bottom was partially blocked out, but not completely. Enough remained to stir my memory. I traced the ink with my finger, my pulse picking up. It wasn't proof, not really.
But it was enough to remind me I wasn't imagining the shape of the past. I slept poorly that night. Dreams stitched together old break room laughter with warning music, Marcus's stunned face layered over Claire's smiling one. I woke just before dawn, heart racing, the echo of confusion still clinging to me like fog. The next morning, Daniel called. "Mom, did you see the photo? Aunt Lydia already commented like 10 hearts," he laughed. "Yes," I said carefully. "You both looked very happy." "We are," he said without hesitation. "I can't wait for you to finally meet her. We're thinking of coming up next weekend if you're free." My fingers tightened around the phone. My instinct was to say yes immediately, to see her in person, to confirm what my eyes already believed. But fear crept in too. What if I was wrong and hurt my son with unfounded suspicion? What if seeing her made everything blur instead of clarify? "That would be lovely," I said after a pause. "I'll make your favorite soup." He chuckled. "Still trying to win me with food, huh?" "Always," I replied, forcing a smile into my voice. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wood grain until the light shifted across it. My reflection in the dark window looked older than I felt, lines deepened by worry, eyes shadowed by a night without rest. I realized then that the hardest part wasn't recognizing her. It was deciding what I owed my son. The days leading up to their visit felt stretched thin, like fabric pulled too tight. I rehearsed casual questions in my head. Where did you grow up? What line of work are you in? How did you two meet? I hoped some small inconsistency would surface naturally, something that would confirm or dismiss my fear without me needing to become the villain in my own family story. When Saturday arrived, I cleaned obsessively. The counters gleamed, the throw pillows were rearranged 3 times. The soup simmered gently on the stove, filling the apartment with the familiar comfort of garlic and herbs. My hands shook slightly as I chopped carrots. The doorbell rang. My heart gave a small, sharp jolt, the kind that surprises you even when you're expecting it. Daniel stood there first, taller than I remembered somehow, smiling wide, eyes bright. He hugged me tightly, smelling faintly of cold air and laundry detergent. Over his shoulder, she stepped into view. Up close, there was no doubt. The scar near her eyebrow was real, the way her eyes assessed the room in a quick, controlled sweep before softening into polite warmth. Exactly the same. Even her voice carried a familiar cadence, smooth and carefully measured. "Mrs. Harris," she said, extending her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you. I'm Claire." Her handshake was firm, confident, professional, the same hands that once signed paperwork that ruined a man's livelihood. "Please," I said quietly, my throat dry, "call me Ellen." She smiled easily. "Thank you, Ellen. I watched her closely as they settled into the living room, as she laughed at Daniel's stories, as she complimented the soup, as she asked me thoughtful questions about my retirement. She was charming in a subtle way, not flashy, but steady, attentive, reassuring. It made my stomach twist. If my memory was correct, this was exactly how she had been back then too. Reliable on the surface, efficient, always appearing harmless. I caught myself gripping my spoon too tightly, my knuckles whitening. At one point, Daniel excused himself to use the restroom.
Claire and I were left alone at the table. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with a polite curiosity. "Daniel tells me you worked in manufacturing for many years," she said. "Administrative side, right?" My pulse jumped. "Yes," I replied slowly. "At Franklin Industrial." Something flickered in her eyes. Fast, subtle, almost invisible. Recognition or coincidence? I couldn't tell. "Oh," she said lightly. "Small world." The words hung between us like a fragile thread. My heart pounded harder. That tiny reaction, barely a crack in her composed exterior, was the first real confirmation that my past and her present were colliding. And now I had a choice to make: stay silent and protect my son's happiness, or dig into a truth that might shatter it. That single flicker in her eyes stayed with me long after they left that afternoon. After hugs at the door and promises to visit again soon, the apartment returned to its familiar quiet. The ticking clock, the distant hum of traffic, the faint scent of soup still lingering in the air. But the silence felt heavier now, crowded with unspoken questions. I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. Oh, small world. It hadn't been the words, it was the hesitation before them, the fractional pause where her mask slipped just enough for me to see something calculating beneath the warmth. If she truly had no connection to Franklin Industrial, the name wouldn't have registered at all. It would have passed like any other unfamiliar detail. But she'd noticed. I was sure of it. That night, I sat at my desk with my old laptop open, the glow of the screen casting pale light across the room. My fingers hovered over the keyboard longer than necessary. I hadn't searched for anything related to that old case in years. It felt like reopening a wound I'd carefully stitched closed. But this wasn't about me anymore. I typed her name, the one I remembered, into the search bar. Nothing. I tried variations, maiden name possibilities, locations tied to the company. Still nothing substantial. She had vanished from public records with remarkable efficiency, like a ghost who knew exactly how to erase her footprints. A cold realization crept in. If she'd been capable of manipulating an internal investigation back then, disappearing quietly wouldn't have been difficult. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, the memory of Marcus rising uninvited. I could still see him sitting in his car in the employee parking lot, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing left in his world. "They said the evidence was airtight," he'd whispered. "But I never did those things, Ellen. I swear on my daughter." His voice had cracked on the last word. I believed him. In my bones, I had believed him. And now, that same woman, the architect of that quiet destruction, was weaving herself into my family. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in nearly 8 years. I called Marcus. It took several tries before the number connected. I wasn't even sure it still belonged to him. When his voice finally came through the speaker, older, rougher, cautious, my chest tightened unexpectedly. "Hello? Marcus, it's Ellen from Franklin." There was a pause, a slow intake of breath. "I haven't heard that name in a long time," he said carefully. "I'm sorry to call out of nowhere," I said. "I hope I'm not intruding." "No," he replied after a moment. "It's just unexpected. How are you?" "Okay," I said honestly. "Retired. Still trying to learn how to enjoy it." He gave a soft, humorless chuckle. I never quite figured that part out. We exchanged small updates, surface-level politeness, like two people stepping carefully around a fragile bridge. Then I took a breath and gently shifted the conversation. "Marcus, do you remember the woman who worked in compliance back then? The one connected to the investigation?" Silence stretched across the line. "I try not to," he said finally. "I think she's about to marry my son." The words landed heavily between us. "That's," he started, then stopped. "Are you sure?" "I saw her. I recognized her, and she reacted when I mentioned the company." His breathing grew audible, uneven. "What's her name now?"
I told him. Another pause. Longer this time. She changed it, he murmured. Of course she did. A chill ran through me. Marcus explained that years after the case, he'd quietly obtained copies of some internal correspondence through a former colleague, messages that strongly suggested documents had been altered, timelines adjusted, enough to imply wrongdoing, but not enough to reopen a formal case. Legal fatigue and financial strain had forced him to let it go. I couldn't afford to fight anymore, he said quietly. My daughter needed stability. I needed peace. I understand, I said, and I truly did. Ellen, if she really is the same person, you need to be careful. She's smart. She doesn't panic. She plans. I swallowed hard. My son loves her. That's what makes this dangerous, Marcus replied gently. When we hung up, my hands were cold. The truth was no longer theoretical. It had weight now, confirmation, and responsibility. I didn't sleep that night either. I kept picturing Daniel's open smile, the trust in his eyes when he spoke about her, the way he leaned slightly toward her when they sat together, like gravity pulled him in her direction. He was building a future with someone who had once dismantled someone else's life without visible remorse. But people can change, I told myself. Time reshapes character. Guilt matures into wisdom. Or does it just learn how to hide better? The thought made my chest ache. I considered confronting Claire directly, asking careful questions, watching her reactions, but Marcus's warning echoed in my head. She planned. She calculated. A direct confrontation could backfire. She could manipulate the narrative before Daniel ever heard my side. So instead, I chose the hardest path. I decided to tell my son, not as an accusation, not as a demand, but as a truth he deserved to weigh for himself. The next morning, I called Daniel and asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us. He sounded cheerful, unsuspecting. Of course, Mom. Everything okay? Yes, I said softly. I just want to talk. My hand lingered on the phone after the call ended, my heart thudding with equal parts fear and resolve. Some truths don't wait for perfect timing. They demand courage instead. We met at a small cafe near the river, one of those places where the windows slightly fog from the warmth inside, and the smell of espresso clings to your coat long after you leave. Ellen arrived first, waving when she saw me through the glass. He had already ordered, his paper cup cradled between his palms like something precious. Hey, Mom, he said, standing to hug me. You sounded serious on the phone. I didn't mean to worry you, I replied, though my voice betrayed me slightly. We sat by the window. Outside, the river moved slowly, reflecting the pale winter sky. A couple walked past with a dog tugging eagerly at its leash. Ordinary life continued, unaware of the fragile moment unfolding at our table. Daniel studied my face carefully. What's going on? I wrapped my hands around my tea, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. I chose my words carefully, as if each one carried weight that could tip the room in either direction. Daniel, I need to talk to you about Claire. His eyebrows lifted slightly, not defensive, curious. Okay, he said gently. What about her? I took a slow breath. Before I say anything else, I want you to know this comes from concern, not judgment. I'm not trying to interfere with your happiness. He nodded, his posture attentive now. When you brought her over, I continued, I recognized her, not as Claire, but from my old job. There was a woman there years ago who was involved in a serious internal case. Someone was wrongly accused and lost his career. Evidence later suggested it had been manipulated. Daniel's face tightened slightly. Mom, are you sure? That's a big thing to say. I am, I said quietly. I confirmed it with someone who lived through it. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly through his nose. The hum of the espresso machine filled the silence between us. You're saying Claire ruined someone's life? He asked, disbelief threading through his voice. I'm saying she played a role in something deeply unethical, I replied. I don't know everything. I only know what I witnessed and what was later uncovered. He stared down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. Why wouldn't
wouldn't she tell me something like that? I don't know, I said gently. People hide things they're ashamed of, or afraid of. His jaw tightened. Or people get mistaken for someone else. That's possible, I acknowledged, but I don't believe that's the case here. Silence stretched. His breathing grew heavier, his eyes distant. Finally, he said quietly, I need to talk to her. Relief and fear collided in my chest. I think that's wise, I said. I'm not asking you to make any decisions today. Just ask questions. Pay attention. He nodded slowly. I will. We finished our drinks in a fragile quiet. When we stood to leave, he hugged me longer than usual, his arms firm around my shoulders. I love you, Mom, he murmured. I love you too, I replied, holding him tightly. Always. 2 days passed. I tried to distract myself with library shifts, reorganizing shelves that didn't need reorganizing, lingering too long over familiar book spines. My mind kept wandering back to Daniel, imagining the conversation he might be having with Claire, the expressions on their faces, the words chosen carefully or recklessly. On the third evening, my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice sounded strained, like he'd been holding something heavy for too long. You were right, he said quietly. My heart sank, even as relief confirmed itself. She admitted she used to work at Franklin, he continued. At first, she said it was a different department, that nothing major happened while she was there. But when I pressed her, she got defensive, said people twist the past, that she was protecting herself in a toxic workplace. That sounds familiar, I said softly. He swallowed audibly. I asked if someone got hurt because of it. She didn't really answer, just said, sometimes collateral damage happens when you're surviving. The words landed heavily. That's not accountability, I said carefully. I know, he replied. His voice cracked slightly. I didn't recognize this side of her. What are you feeling? I asked. Confused, angry, sad, he admitted. I love her, Mom, or I thought I did, but now I don't know who she really is. My heart ached for him. It's okay to take time. You don't have to solve this tonight. I asked for space, he said. She's staying with a friend. I exhaled slowly, tension easing slightly. That sounds like a healthy step. There was a pause. Then he said quietly, thank you for telling me, even though it hurts. I wish I could have spared you pain, I said. You spared me something worse, he replied. Word didn't stay contained for long. Family sensed the shift immediately. Postponed planning calls, vague explanations, uneasy silences in group chats. My sister asked gently if everything was okay. I kept my response neutral, protecting Daniel's privacy. A week later, Claire reached out to me directly. Her message was polite, controlled. Ellen, I understand you shared concerns with Daniel about my past. I'd appreciate the opportunity to clarify in person. I stared at the screen for a long time. Part of me felt uneasy. Another part felt resolved. If there was going to be truth, it needed light. We agreed to meet at the same cafe. When she arrived, she looked composed but tired. Dark circles beneath carefully applied makeup, shoulders slightly tense. She met my eyes directly. I never wanted my past to follow me into my future, she said quietly. I folded my hands on the table. Then the best way forward is honesty. She exhaled slowly. I made choices back then that I regret. I was ambitious, afraid. I didn't think about the long-term consequences. Someone lost his career, I said gently. His stability, his peace. Her jaw tightened. I know. The air between us felt heavy with unsaid remorse and unresolved accountability. This conversation wasn't about winning. It was about truth and its consequences. Claire didn't cry. That was the first thing I noticed as we sat across from each other, the low murmur of the cafe blending into a soft blur around us. Her hands rested neatly around her cup, fingers steady. Her composure had the practiced calm of someone who had learned how to contain difficult emotions rather than express them. I was younger, she said after a moment. I felt invisible at work. I was constantly afraid of being overlooked, replaced. When the compliance audit started, I panicked. I convinced myself I was protecting my future by sacrificing someone else's, I replied gently. Her eyes flickered downward. Yes, that single word carried more weight than any excuse. I altered a few timelines in the documentation, she admitted quietly. Nothing dramatic, just enough to shift responsibility. I didn't think think it would spiral the way it did, but it did, I said. She nodded. It did. For a moment, neither of us spoke. A barista steamed milk behind the counter, the hiss punctuating the silence. Outside, a child laughed as they skipped across puddles left by melting snow. Did you ever try to make it right? I asked. Her lips pressed together. I thought about it many times, but by the time I understood the damage, the company had closed the case. Lawyers were involved. I was advised to stay quiet, and then life kept moving. That man had to rebuild everything, I said softly. He still carries the weight of what happened. Her shoulders tightened. I know. I live with it. I studied her face, the controlled restraint, the faint exhaustion beneath the surface. She wasn't monstrous. She was human, flawed, afraid, capable of both harm and remorse. But remorse didn't erase consequences. Daniel deserves transparency, I said. He deserves to know who he's building a life with, fully. She nodded slowly. I agree. I was going to tell him eventually. When? I asked gently. She didn't answer. That silence was answer enough. A few days later, Daniel called again. His voice sounded steadier this time, grounded in quiet resolve rather than raw emotion. We talked for hours, he said. Really talked. She admitted everything, not just the work situation, but how she avoids conflict, how she controls narratives when she feels threatened. I realized I've been seeing the version of her she wanted me to see. That's a painful realization, I said. Yeah, he agreed softly, but it's also clarifying. He paused before continuing. We decided to postpone the wedding indefinitely. My chest tightened with mixed relief and sorrow. How are you feeling about that? Sad, he admitted, but also lighter, like I stepped away from something that would have slowly suffocated me. I closed my eyes briefly, letting gratitude settle quietly in my heart. I'm proud of you. Thank you for trusting me with the truth, he said, even when it was uncomfortable. The news rippled gently through the family. Questions surfaced. Speculation followed, but Daniel handled it with grace, choosing privacy over public explanation. Claire withdrew quietly from our orbit. No drama, no confrontation, just distance. I heard later through a mutual acquaintance that she had started therapy, that she was finally unpacking the patterns she'd spent years avoiding. I hoped, sincerely, that she would find growth there. Accountability isn't a punishment, it's a doorway. Marcus and I spoke again a few weeks later. When I told him the wedding was postponed, he fell silent for a long moment. I'm glad the truth mattered to someone, he said quietly. It always mattered, I replied, even when it took time to surface. He exhaled softly. Thank you, Alan, for not letting it stay buried. Life gradually returned to its softer rhythms. Daniel started visiting more often, cooking dinner with me, laughing more easily again, rediscovering himself outside the gravity of a complicated relationship. The apartment felt warmer when he was there, the silence replaced by shared stories and comfortable quiet. One evening, as we washed dishes side by side, he said thoughtfully, "You know, this could have gone very differently if you hadn't spoken up." I nodded, and it could have gone very differently if you hadn't been willing to listen. He smiled gently. Guess we both showed up when it mattered. Time doesn't erase wounds completely, but it does teach us how to carry them with wisdom instead of fear. I learned that protecting someone you love sometimes means risking discomfort. It means trusting truth even when it shakes fragile happiness. It means choosing integrity over silence. Claire wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. She was a person shaped by fear, ambition, and avoidance, like many of us, only with heavier consequences. I hope she continues to grow into someone capable of facing her past with courage. And Daniel, my son, grew into a man who chose clarity over convenience, honesty over comfort. Watching that has been one of the quiet privileges of my life. Sometimes I still think back to that first moment, the cold coffee in my hands, the photo glowing on my phone, the tightening in my chest. That instinct wasn't fear, it was love trying to protect what mattered most. Would you have spoken up if you were in my place? Or would you have stayed silent to preserve peace? If this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that truth, handled with care, can heal more than it hurts.